This morning, obviously, we talked about red and yellow flag, some of the legislative 72-hour waiting period, etc. This afternoon, we're going to focus on land and wildlife conservation. So, standing behind me is Jeff Romano. He's from Maine Coast Heritage Trust. He's going to give an overview of conserved land in Maine and some proposed legislation for long-term funding. So, I will turn it over to Jeff, and it's all yours. And everybody will be able to hear it because the microphone works now.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. As Mike said, I'm going to be providing a quick overview of land conservation in Maine, what the state is of land conservation. There's a lot of conversations in the State House and other places, and a lot of kind of misinformation, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page of what land conservation looks like in the state of Maine in 2025. I have this opening slide here. To me, this captures the breadth and diversity of land conservation in the state. It's working lands and access for snowmobiling and hiking and deer habitat. Let's see, is this going to move or not?
If it doesn't, I can just enter. I'll do it. There we go. I can be your mouse, just tell me and I'll hit that.
Okay, I got a lot of clicks in it, sorry. So the data that I'm presenting today is based on two primary sources. There's a database of GIS that the state collects, and at Maine Coast Heritage Trust we also do a survey of land conservation organizations every 5 years. I've tried to blend those together where it's appropriate. These are estimates largely, but they're really close to the actual numbers. The GIS data layer in the state captures about 90% of actual conservation land, so I have to account for that a little bit. So in the state of Maine right now, there's 1.36 million acres that are public lands. Oh, sorry, I got too many clicks. 650,000 acres are owned by land trusts. And then there's another 2.4 million acres that are conservation easements. These are our private lands and the conservation easements that ensure that the land is either not developed or it's available for working forests or agricultural. A lot of times they allow for public access or guarantees public access. And so the total in the state is 4.4 million acres. So sometimes people will see that 4.4 million acres and assume that's all public ownership. It's not. There's a big mixture in the state. Again, 6.9 is the percentage that's owned by the public.
Sorry, you pointed.
Yeah. Okay, so
we'll have this all worked out by the time you get
I put too many of these things in there. So just to go through the history of how we got here. So some of the early conservation efforts. Yeah. So this is 1980 data that I was able to find. So in 1980, the state had about 950,000 acres of public land, and most of the conservation land of the state was publicly owned. So these are places like Acadia National Park, White Mountain National Forest, Baxter State Park, that's Bradbury Mountain State Park, there's about 70,000 acres of other state parks in the state. And then the largest chunk of this land in 1980 were public lands. These were lands in the unorganized territory. The deeds traced back all the way to 1820, but a lot of those properties were consolidated into larger holdings. That was about 450,000 of the public lands in the state, traced all the way back to 1820. So in the late 80s and early 1990s, there was a change that began in the state. There was a lot of unease about a change in land ownership patterns in North Maine woods. There was housing booms and real estate booms, and there was a move to start conserving land more aggressively in the state and making sure that public access was secure. So in that time, the Land for Maine's Future program was created in 1987. The voters approved a $35 million bond. And that money was all for public land acquisition at the time. And at the same time also, a lot of the local land trusts were formed in the state. So Maine Coast Heritage Trust started in 1970, but there's about 80 local land trusts in the state. They're on towns, sometimes counties or regions. And a lot of them formed in the late 80s and early 90s at this very time. So this property here is Dodge Point. That's the first property that was protected with Land for Maine's Future money. That's in Newcastle. Mount Kineo was protected as sort of an iconic. So a lot of properties that the $35 million were spent on were these really iconic properties like Mount Kineo and the Cutler Coast and places like that to get people onto the land. And again, I mentioned the land trust movement took off. So Maine Coast Heritage Trust started in 1970. We didn't own any land for about 15 years. We were working more closely with the Acadia National Park to conserve land near that park through conservation easements. When we started acquiring land in the late 1980s, this is a property we have at Hamilton Cove in Lubec. And as you'll see, there wasn't much land conservation by land trusts in the 1980s, and that has really taken off. So LMF steps up in 1997, so there was kind of a lull from 87 to $35 million was spent, and the country had a little recession in the 90s, and not much happened from a land conservation standpoint. In the late 90s, Governor Angus King created a Land Acquisition Priorities Committee that was it spurred a lot more conversation about rejuvenating the Land for Maine's Future program at the time. It led to a $50 million bond issue. Yeah. So again, at the time, you can see that in 1997, we had a little bit of an uptick in the amount of public lands that occurred from the 950,000 acres. That Land Acquisition Priorities Council had those numbers for land conservation for land trust, 45,000 acres and 54,000 acres of conservation easements. So the $50 million bond came in 1999. They added an emphasis on farmland protection. They also added emphasis for recreational water access, boat launches and things like that. They also created an opportunity for cooperating entities on the Land for Maine's Future program. So the first bulk of LMF was about expanding public ownership, mostly IF&W and Bureau of Parks and Lands. But the realization at that time was that we don't want to rely on the state to have to do all this. Let's work with municipal partners, let's work for land trust partners to share the cost of acquiring this land and also maintaining the land. So that's an example of a boat launch in Gardner that was acquired. And this is Beach Hill Preserve, which is a coastal mountains land trust preserve in Rockport. It's a good example of one of the early cooperating entity projects that LMF took place. This is a highly used project, really close to a tourist destination and other places. So then LMF evolves over the next 10 years or so. We had voter approved bonds, kind of hit or miss. So the first two bonds were multi-year bonds, and then we had bonds in 2005, 2007, 2010, 2012. They combined for about $46 million. In that time, LMF added a priority for working waterfronts, and also working with Sportsman's Alliance of Maine, we added a prioritization for deer habitat. Subsequently, in the 2020s, after another lull, the legislature approved a $40 million appropriations for LMF. In that iteration, we built into the program a greater emphasis on community projects, so projects where closer to where people live and work and recreate. And then more recently, we created what's called the LMF Trust Fund. So what was left of the $40 million that was appropriated by the legislature in 2021, in 2023, that was moved out of the pot of money that the state manages within the general fund and moved into a separate account, and then it began to accumulate its own interest incomes. So effectively, that $40 million has turned into $42 million with interest income over the last 2 years. An example of sort of the community aspect, this is Hackers Hill, which is a property overlooking Sebago Lake in the town of Casco. You can see they have outdoor concerts here. It's a kind of a spiritual place for a lot of locals there as well. Again, kind of the program is transitioning. In the early effort was a lot of places like Mount Kineo, these kind of iconic places like I was saying. And now the program is more and more incorporating these projects closer to where people live. And it still does the large landscape ones, but it's doing more for more people now. So big picture on LMF. Click it again. Click it a third time. So the process is, for those who don't know, the LMF is a competitive grant process. So the program, it's not, the state doesn't go out and aggressively look for properties. What's happening are communities and organizations, land trusts, and others are coming together. They're coming to the Land for Maine's Future program with a proposal and they're competing against other projects around the state. And the LMF board, which is comprised of people nominated by the governor, approved by the legislature, and by city commissioners, they can go through a rigorous process of evaluating and scoring those projects and then decide which projects get funded. It's all based on willing sellers. It's a really public process. The public's invited to attend all of these meetings. And all acquisitions are done based on appraised value. So you have to get an appraiser that determines what the value is, and that's what the program can't spend money above appraised value. There is municipal involvement throughout the process. There's notification to municipalities. So for municipalities that may be concerned about land being conserved in their town, they are notified from our LMF. They're invited to come to the public meeting and make their case if they have any concerns. I've only seen that one time, one individual from a select board, not speaking on behalf of that select board, showed up and had some concerns. And other big picture items, the program matches 1-to-1. So for every state dollars put in, the applicant has to come up with another dollar. In practice, it usually is more like $2.50 to $3 to 1. So for every dollar the state does, we're matching $2.50 to $3. In the language, the last language there was about, used to be in all the bond issues, and now it's in this legislation, in the statute, that hunting, trapping, fishing, and public access cannot be prohibited other than under current laws. So that's what the state is doing on the state basis. Just for further information, the federal government also provides some land acquisition money. Here are some of the programs. Forest Legacy focuses on large forest easements primarily. Land and Water Conservation has money that helps expand places like Acadia National Park and the White Mountains, but also provides money to the Bureau of Parks and Lands. It gets fed down to municipalities that can acquire municipal properties or state parks. And then these other two protect wetland habitats primarily for migratory birds, a lot of times duck habitats, things like that. So again, back to where we are in conservation. So that's kind of how we've gotten to where we are. There's 31% of our property in the state that's conserved as public land. Another 15% is owned by land trusts, and the bulk, over 54% of these private conservation easements. So I'll go into a little detail about what those mean. Again, this is one more. And further illustrations of the growth that's happened over the last 30 years. Again, most of the growth has been in that conservation, easement, and land trust category. Public lands have only gone from 4.8% to 6.9%, so it hasn't been this big land grab on the part of government. Just to put the public, just to put the public lands into context, so Maine at 6.9% is actually the lowest percentage in New England. It's one of the lowest percentages for public lands in the Northeast, and the East Coast, excuse me. Just for comparison, the state of Florida, 26% of the state of Florida is publicly owned. New Jersey, which is a lot of the times the butt of a lot of the jokes around here, over 25%. I'm proud of New Jersey because there's a lot of Italian Americans there, but there's 25% of New Jersey is publicly owned. And even in New Hampshire, live free or die, 20% of New Hampshire is also publicly owned. Now these states also have land trusts that own land and that do conservation easements, but in Maine the mix is much stronger on the part of the private sector doing this work. And I think that's what's been so successful, is we're not dependent on the public sector. This is the private sector in concert with the public sector in terms of LMF funding and things, but it's really private entities that are stepping up to provide what the public wants in terms of access to the natural resources, in terms of working landscapes. This is happening in other states with the federal government, in large part our state and county governments. Further evidence of the working forest easements. So these 5 working forest easements comprise 43.6% of the conservation land in the state of Maine. They 1.9 million acres. It all started with the Pingree easement in 1999. That was actually done with no public money at all, but 762,000 acres. So when you look at that property, the Pingree family, which has been around for centuries, I guess, their land ownership is larger than that. They looked at their entire land ownership And they said, this is the part we're going to conserve. They left other parts remaining potentially for development or what have you, what they want to do with it. But that 762,000 acres is conserved. It's all working lands. It's all in the tax rolls, as with all these other properties. The ones that have public dollars involved are guaranteed public access. You can access the Pingree easement, it's just not built into the easement, but it's all open land for traditional uses. So a closer look at land trust. So 94% of the land trust conserved lands. This is lands that we own in fee or lands that we've conserved with conservation easements. At least 94% of that land is open for hunting. These are the litany of the recreational trails that are available, over 2,000 miles of hiking trails, 1,000 miles of snowmobile trails, 1,200 miles of mountain biking trails, and 675 miles of ATV trails. So this has access for a whole variety of uses. And there's more than 230 recreational water access sites on these properties as well. I think I have less clicking from now on. So a closer look at land trust in terms of working land. So 86% of the land trust conserved lands in the state are managed as working forests. There's another 40,000 acres that are working farms. And there are 63 coastal access sites that are available for commercial fishermen, whether some of them are docks and piers, but the bulk of them are access for clammers and wormers and folks like that. I know a lot of people are concerned about property taxes. So property taxes, this is the data for land trust preserves. So land trust own about 650,000 acres. Of those acres, 70% of that land is still on the tax rolls. Another 21% is land that the land trust is tax exempt, but they're making payments in lieu of taxes as if they were still on the tax rolls, or basically as if they were enrolled in tree growth or open space, which are current use programs available to all private landowners. So the most recent year, land trust paid over $1.5 million in taxes to local municipal governments. Again, some people have concerns about you're paying less than the highest and best use. That's correct, as are most lands that are owned by forest landowners and farmers and others. Most of the land in this state, about 12 million acres, is in current use out of the 19.5 million acres. And current use is assessing that land based on how it's being used as working forest, as working farmland, or as open space available for people, as opposed to its development potential. And so land trusts are taking advantage of those current use programs the way a lot of other landowners, large and small, take advantage. And it's a change that the voters approved in the 1970s. I think it's done a great job of conserving land in the state, not permanently, although de facto a lot of this land hasn't really changed over time. I think the current use program is a really good program. So in terms of the property taxes on conservation easements, there are some easements that land trusts own that are on state or government properties, so those lands are tax exempt. But the bulk of the conservation easements that land trusts hold are on private land ownership, so all of that's on the tax rolls. So when you combine all that together, 97.8% of the lands that land trusts have conserved have remained on the tax rolls. Just for some background on public lands, the public lands are tax exempt, but it doesn't mean that they're not also contributing to the tax base. This is data that I had from 2020. The state parks has a revenue sharing for municipalities that state parks are located. On that 85,000 acres, they share over $400,000. That compares really favorably. That's probably better than if that land was in tree growth. Those towns are doing better with that land. The federal government as well, for all lands that are wildlife refuges, state parks, the national monument, not state parks, national park, the national monument, national forest, they do revenue sharing or payments in lieu. They did $857,000 last year on that 283,000 acres. That's pretty comparable to what that land would be generating under the tree growth tax program. And then sometimes there's sort of interesting one-off kind of thing. So in LMF, when the Cutler public land was acquired, there was an agreement made at the time with the town of Cutler to maintain a fund for keeping the town whole on taxes. Same thing happened in Amherst. There's an Amherst community forest. It was the same type of an agreement. And also in the town of Addison in Washington County, a new wildlife management area was created there. And there was a fund created to make sure that that town wasn't losing tax revenue. So a lot of times these conversations happen on given projects, and land trusts and conservation partners are in concert with the community to make sure everyone is supportive of what the goals are, and that it's public access, it's maintaining the wildlife habitat and so forth, but making sure that it's not negatively impacting the tax base as well. It's probably too small for you to see, but this was a chart that we presented recently at a hearing on a bill to cap public lands in the state, and it just provides a breakdown of where some of the public lands are. So you have the total land area in the state. Total land area that's conserved is at 4.4 million acres, and part of this was based on this bill that tried to cap public land ownership and was defining public land ownership more broadly than reality. So again, this gets you that 7% on that right-hand column is how much is conserved. There's about another 8% that is defined as public interest, and this would be land that is privately owned either by a land trust or just a regular private landowner that the state or federal government had some sort of property interest in because they contributed Land for Maine's future funding to, or Forest Legacy funds to. So that's about 8%. And then there's another 7% of the land that's been conserved that's outside of both of those. So it's not publicly owned, and the public has no public interest in it, hasn't contributed any money to it. So it's actually a pretty good breakdown, I think, that shows that every project is different, and sometimes it makes sense for the state to be really engaged in it if it's a project that has really significant wildlife, natural resource habitat qualities, or it's really important from a public access standpoint with large numbers of people, particularly from people traveling great distances to go. Those types of projects really call on state or federal partners to contribute. And then you have more local projects where it's really a local interest, and it makes more sense for those resources to happen more locally. And this stuff happens organically in partnership. Land trusts and state agencies and municipal partners and others work collaboratively, project by project, to figure out what's the right mix for each particular project. I think the largest message I want to deliver to you is that again, like I said earlier, a lot of how this plays out in other states is really a government-focused effort. You go out into the western United States, you're looking at 50, 60, 70% of those states owned by the federal government. Those public benefits that the public wants, that access to those outdoors, the protection of those natural resources, the main blueprint for addressing that is really leaning on private entities, private landowners who are being philanthropic, private landowners who are willing to put conservation easements on their property to protect these natural resources for the long haul, and land trusts to step up and provide private dollars to provide the access, not only on our lands. There's a lot of public lands in the state that land trusts actually help to manage on behalf of the state. That Dodge Point picture that I showed you earlier, that's owned by the state's Bureau of Parks and Lands and the local land trust, the Coastal Rivers Conservation Association. Probably getting that name wrong. It's Coastal Rivers. They manage that property for the state. And that happens, Kennebec Highlands is the same thing, it's 6,000 acres not far from here. The Seven Lakes Alliance Land Trust is a key manager of those lands. And that's the type of collaboration and partnership that you get in Maine. It's not all the burden is being borne by Maine taxpayers. And I think that it's worked well for the state, and I think the support that we see from the voters and others, I think, is a testament to that.